This is Akashvani. In the weekly program Current Affairs, now we bring a discussion on rising stature of India in the evolving global scenario. The participants are Dr. Harsh V. Pant, strategic analyst, and Elizabeth Roach, journalist.
Professor Pant, we are going to be talking on the subject of the rising stature of India in the world. I would like to say that, or I would like to think rather, that India's stature has definitely risen several notches in the past decade, and it is a lot got to do with the confidence that India has gained because of its economic weight, as well as the fact that we have rather decisive government, not rather, but definitely a decisive government in New Delhi, in a majority. So these are the reasons why I think that we definitely are seeing a more confident India today. What are your thoughts on this?
We have had in the last decade almost a transformative effect on India's standing in the world. And of course, as you outlined, there are a number of reasons for that. One can look at them from an economic vantage point, from a leadership vantage point. But I think what is striking is that India finds itself at an inflection point where the global order is evolving in a manner, in a direction which places India in a very privileged position. And I think Indian leadership, Indian diplomacy has been able to utilize that opportunity to a significant extent. So I think certainly when you look at what has happened in the last decade and where we are today, it's a world order in common, and that world order, that global order allows India enormous opportunities which I think India has been more than willing to exploit to its advantage. And that's the reason why we continue to see engagement from multiple sides, engagement, countries wanting to engage with India, as well as India itself trying to aspire for what it has always called this role of a leading player in global politics, one that shapes outcomes rather is shaped by the global order. So I think there has been a transformative change in Indian foreign policy, and that is quite visible at the moment at a number of levels.
The Prime Minister's recent visit to the US. Now, this was one of the rare state visits of the Biden presidency. So, if you're looking at the visit and the outcomes of the visit, which are numerous and in many ways unprecedented, if I can call it that, how does this reflect on India's rising stature, the outcomes of the visit?
The visit has been very successful, and the visit has also underscored the commitment on the part of the US to continue to engage with India at a very substantive level. The confidence of the US in Indian leadership at the moment is also quite striking, because you may recall that we have had in the past these episodes where we have discussed whether a particular president is going to be good for India or not. Particularly going to be good for India. And this is a debate we have been having under Trump, and then Mr. Biden came. There were many in India who were worried, whether Mr. Biden's focus on certain kinds of issues would preclude strategic partnership with the US. But I think what we have seen is that America has continued with its strategic commitment to India, and India has been not shy of pushing forth an agenda with the US, which is quite ambitious. Whether you look at our relationship today with technology or on defense, both of these issues at one point in time were constraints, seen as constraints. But today we have unleashed the potential. And also, I think I would add that the partnership itself has become global in nature. We sit with the US as part of Ford in the Indo-Pacific, as part of I2U2 in the Middle East. So that partnership itself is becoming very expansive in the way it is defining its own goal and its own ambitions and aspirations. So in some ways, India has been very, very vocal and has pushed the envelope when it has come to the US relations. US has reciprocated, but I think in this case, given India's domestic political compulsions, a lot of credit should go to the government.
The fact that there was a time when India would be looking at which president comes in and what kind of priority would India be, in the US agenda, in the foreign policy agenda at one point of time. We used to wonder about it. But given the fact that you had a very successful speech to both houses of the US Congress, And the invitation came from both sides of the aisle. That itself, it shows that it's no more limited to the Republican Party, right? I mean, this goodwill for India extends across the aisle, both sides of the aisle.
Absolutely. And I think that is again credible because we know how polarized American politics is and has
Yes.
been for the last few years. And in that
Yes.
polarization, India could be the one actor that can actually bridge the difference between the two parties. It's quite extraordinary. If this were a discussion happening a decade and a half back, we would all be it would all be very amusing. But I think we have seen successive administrations come and we have seen successive administrations deal with India now, Republicans, Democrats, presidents, which is a very different temperament. Trump was not a traditional Republican. He dealt with Trump very, very effectively, and we have dealt with Mr. Biden equally effectively. So what it tells you is that I think the long-term trajectory of Indo-US engagement is now set. The only question remains how much can we accomplish, in that short to medium term.
If we switch tracks and, look at the upcoming visit of the Prime Minister to France, now this again is in a way a major honor if you look at it because it's Prime Minister is going to be the guest at the Bastille Day celebrations. How do you look at the rising stature of India and this invitation for as a guest of honor, the Prime Minister being the guest of honor at the Bastille Day celebrations?
It's a recognition of historical ties that India and France have shared. But it is also a recognition of the special role that Mr. Modi has played in nurturing those ties and how important India has become in French global outreach. I think when you look at the European landscape today, you see all the countries trying to engage India more substantively than ever before. And part of the reason is that India itself has become much more expansive and open about its ties with the West. Older hesitations are gone about getting any close to the West would come with its set of ideological issues. Those have been marginalized and sidelined. And what we see is a relationship that is based on contemporary realities and based on a very fundamental understanding in India that a solid relationship with the West is important for India's developmental potential. And I think France in particular has played such an important role because France was the first country, was perhaps the only country in Europe when other countries were looking elsewhere, France was looking to India. So France has continued to maintain a very historical relationship, a very dense relationship across different domains with India. India has done in the last few years is not only reached out to France in a more substantive way, but also making it clear that India will continue to work with Europe in ways that perhaps were not thought of before. Whether you look at hard security issues, Indo-Pacific, maritime security, all of those issues where at one point in time, both perhaps the European Union and India would have been hesitant. Today, we don't see that hesitation. So in a sense, France's invitation represents perhaps the high watermark of India's engagement in Europe, and in particular when it comes to India-France relations. This is certainly an acknowledgement that this has been one of the more substantive relationships of India and Western Europe.
You were talking about a little earlier, you were talking about the technology element, which is there in the India-US relationship. So my question here is, we've seen India open dialogue on high technology, whether it's AI, it's all encompassing, with both the EU at one level, and there is a similar understanding, the ICET for that dialogue, between the NSAs of India and the US at the other level. Now, this brings India sort of into global high table of technology, if I can put it like that. I mean, I'm not sure you agree with me, but in that sense, this is also a mark of India's, a recognition or a mark of India's, rising profile where it comes to technology, contributions to technology and innovation and those kind of things, right? At the end of the day, most of our people who work abroad are in the IT and ITES and that kind of workers that we have abroad, right? Would you agree with me?
Belatedly, perhaps, but you do see an acknowledgement now coming from in the West that India's foundations for high-end technology that were laid in the last few decades are quite strong. And on the basis of that, with all the challenges that India faces, India potentially is not only a good partner, but also can deliver on outcomes in ways that perhaps China would never have done. So as I think we are looking at India-US and India-Europe partnership on high technology, it is mark of how far we have traveled. Recently, New York Times, which is not particularly fond of India most of the time, carried a story on India's space power and how
Yes.
India in space is something to be reckoned with. And I think sense that India, whether you look at space, nuclear, increasingly how India is using some of its high-end technologies to create an ecosystem, that as well as the softer elements, India's, as you were mentioning, it is India's talent that is nurturing a lot of the technology industry in the West. The recognition that we need that talent pool is very vast, is leading to two things. One, we are now increasingly talking directly with our interlocutors in the West about the potential of what can happen if we work together. So whether it was the ISET, Initiative on Critical and Emerging Technologies with US, or Strategic and Technology Council with the European Union, both of them underscore this commitment by the West that they really want to build this partnership, take it forward. But also what we have seen is that this is about laying the foundations of the future of global technology landscape, where China is going to be a problem, but India is going to be a country that is going to provide solutions, and it is going to create an ecosystem or help create an ecosystem that can deliver the goods not only for these two actors, but also for the world at large.
The fact that India is one of the fastest growing major economies, that is also contributing factor, if I can put it like that, in India's rising profile, right? I mean, the fact that we may still lag behind some countries when it comes to infrastructure, etc., but we are, the IMF described us to be one bright spot in the gloomy global economic landscape. So that also contributes to India's rising profile, right? I mean, you have, for example, the Micron group setting up a semiconductor unit in Gujarat. All these are factors, right?
When you look at the world today, you look at economic despondency writ large in most parts of the world. The West is not doing particularly well. Bad news is coming from China on economy day in and day out. And India stands out. India stands out amidst this doom and gloom as a country that, despite its challenges, has been able to provide the world for the kind of economic dynamism that no one thought India would ever be able to do. Change of perception is quite remarkable. That even under the most difficult circumstances, when some of the most established economies crumbled, we did not. And I think that changes the perception. That look, COVID happened, Ukraine war happened, China decoupling is going on, China world is looking at de-risking and decoupling from China. Galvan happened. And we continue to stand our ground. We continue to do our bit for our national security interests, as well as we continue to grow. And we also were trying to help others at times when no one else was doing. So we are not only looking inwards, we are not only trying to build our own capacities, but whatever our challenges, whatever our deficiencies, even with all that, we are still willing to help the rest of the world solve some of the problems. And that perhaps could not have been solved without India. So I think that perception that India is no longer simply a country that is persistently a problem country. India is a country that is at the forefront of providing global solutions to global problems, and India is a country that is sticking out as a bright spot amidst all the doom and gloom. That has made a lot of difference when you have companies that are looking at India at the time when the West and China are at loggerheads, when companies are moving out of China, when they want China plus one strategy. The one country that can provide them the scale is India. And I think that's what we are seeing in some of the decisions that have been taken, whether it is Apple or whether it is Micron now. Those decisions will continue, and India will have to continue to work on this agenda, because this is the best possible opportunity India has got, and India should not let its guard down at this particular point, because the rest of the world is willing to come to India and to deliver in India, for India, and for the world.
If I look at the two major summits that India was hosting this year, one we've just finished hosting, which is the SEO. The other one, of course, is the big one, which is the G20, which is happening in September. Here, my question is that some critics might say that, the SEO was a virtual summit. It wasn't quite up to what we thought it would be, the outcomes, etc. The G20, there are issues over Ukraine, etc. But the fact that India has put together a coherent agenda for both, for the SEO as well as for the G20, it's done its best in terms of, and it is still doing its best to get a consensus going, whether it's within the G20 or whether it was within the SEO. That all just adds up and embellishes India's credentials, right, as a country that can actually deliver.
India is one of the few countries today that can actually engage with multiple stakeholders that have divergent interests and divergent agendas. No other country in the world I can think of can possibly do this. Look at how we are engaging with the SEO at a time just days after Mr. Modi's visit to the US. Now, SEO was established as an anti-Western platform by Russia and China in 1990, in 2001, with four Central Asian countries. The agenda was very, very stark that NATO should not come to Central Asia, that the West should not have a presence in Central Asia. And India becoming a partner of SEO changes the dynamic. We saw the debate during SEO. India makes SEO more than just an anti-Western platform. India has no interest in reviving the anti-Western narrative of the past. What India wants is action in Central Asia. What India wants is connectivity, trade, and outreach in Central Asia. And that's what India pushed during the SEO meeting. And similarly, when you look at India's engagement with other platforms, similarly when you look at India's engagement with G20, what India will push and is pushing the agenda of the global South. India, these platforms provide an opportunity to burnish its own credentials as a leader that can respond to the challenges of the 21st century, and that can create or build bridges between multiple stakeholders who may not be on talking terms. But it is not India's problem if West and Russia are not talking. It is their problem. They have to figure out how they want to work with each other. But India will figure out from its own perspective that we will host G20, we will host SEO, and we will try to ensure that our agenda, our interests, our requirements are met, and we push forth a positive agenda where countries can think of working together in circumstances where certain basic principles and norms are followed. Something that India once again alluded to when it criticized BRI at the SEO. But the argument was that we want connectivity, but connectivity on whose terms? Connectivity cannot be on a hegemonistic terms. And I think that's the agenda that India pushed at the SEO. India will push a similar agenda at G20, where it will try to bring countries together, major powers together, to address the concerns of the developing world, which are undergoing a massive economic crisis, and no one is listening to them. So I think India's agenda is quite distinct from the major power agenda, and those major powers will have to figure out what they want to do with each other. But even if they're not able to figure out, India will continue to pursue its own relationships individually based on what its requirements are.
A little earlier in the discussion, you mentioned about India offering solutions. One thing which to me is pretty remarkable is at Glasgow, India came up with it that, we are going to have our 2070, India made its deadline clear, when it's going to become carbon neutral. So these kind of solutions being offered, for example, another example is the millets, because we have climate crisis, we have issues with water shortages across the world. It's not only in one geographical region or another. Now, this is a new badge, isn't it, for India? A relatively new badge, if I can put it to you. And that also coincides with the rise in its stature across the world. Yoga, for instance, the way we have, yoga was known all through. Everybody knew about yoga. But the fact that we sort of made it universal, that also is a badge of honor for India, right? For a rising India.
Yes, and I think very, very important change in India's perspective, where in the past, Delhi was much more clearer when it came to underlining the challenge, much less clear when it came to providing solutions. Today, I think the whole argument has shifted to what can India do for the international order, for the international system. If there are problems, what positive agenda India brings to the table. We have seen from the International Solar Alliance to the Coalition on Disaster Resilience Initiative, Infrastructure, CDRI. From that, we have seen engagement when it comes to global issues of HADR or climate change. And I think we sense that India will have to work with the world and will have to shape the agenda of the world by also being proactive on agenda setting models. That I think has been a great change, and that has been a positive change, and that is a change that is reflective in every single domain that you think of, whether climate, whether sustainability, whether technology, maritime security. On all this, we have seen how India has been engaging much more substantively than ever before. India has been putting forth ideas on the table which are new and refreshing, and more importantly, when ideas come from India, a lot of the countries take them up because they look as if they are free of the kind of geopolitical framework that other countries bring to the table, especially the major powers.
The agenda of the major powers.
So I think that also gives ideas great receptivity on the global stage, and that change is quite visible.
India has been pretty, how do you put it, seen across the world, if I can put it like that. I mean, when I say seen across the world, I mean, I'm talking in terms of visits abroad by the Prime Minister, by the External Affairs Minister, by the Ministers of State, by other members of the Cabinet as well, and not only the Ministry of External Affairs or by the Prime Minister. It's a very active and engaged India today. It's a much more active and a much more engaged India today. I know you've touched on this, but if you could just elaborate on this.
Yes, it's a much more engaged India, certainly. And what is also interesting is that there is a whole of government approach to policy making, which has a lot of difference. When you are not working in silos, when your agendas are not contradictory, we are negotiating at the moment a number of these free trade agreements. Foreign Minister, External Affairs Minister speaks, and when the Trade Minister speaks, they both speak the same language, in the same idiom. So I think that conveys a sense of urgency, a sense of commitment, as well as a sense of seriousness, that we are now serious about these things. We want outcomes. Our foreign policy is outcome-oriented. Our engagement with the world is outcome-oriented. After all, India and Indian policymakers, especially Prime Minister himself, has been making it very clear that foreign policy has to deliver for India's development needs. That has to happen, that the whole of government has to work together to achieve those things. Foreign Minister himself can't be the only face of India. And I think that has changed as we look at a more holistic and rounded approach by the government on a range of issues on the global map. And therefore, every aspect is well represented when you have Finance Minister, Foreign Minister, Trade Minister, Oil and Gas Minister, Infrastructure. All of these ministers engage with the world, tell India's story, and also try to get the best bargain for India. That gives Indian diplomacy an edge that perhaps it did not have in the past, or other countries may not have.
One question which I'd like to ask you about is India's exercise of strategic autonomy. How has that contributed to its rising profile?
What I feel is that India, by taking decisions which are widely seen as independent decisions, as decisions in the best interest of India, and decisions that are not disruptive of the global order, India has created a perception around the world that India is a country that believes in maintaining the global order, that believes in sustaining the contemporary global order with some changes. But it is also in some ways a country that is redefining the terms of engagement in which it engages the world. And so as we look at the world today, which is flux and which has to sort of engage on very different terms, I think India's ideas and India's role will continue to be very, very important as we move forward. And I think India has positioned itself well. The global order has given India certain opportunities, and India has made it very clear that it wants to tap into those opportunities.
So full marks to Prime Minister Narendra Modi and External Affairs Minister S. Jaishankar for steering India's foreign policy in such a way that India's profile is not only risen, but rising even further, right?
I would say yes. It has been a very, very difficult time for every country in the world. Now, if you are looking at, at the context in which the world is operating, and if you look at the outcome that Indian diplomacy has been able to produce, it is quite remarkable for India. And therefore, we would have to agree that Indian diplomats, Indian policymakers, Indian leadership, from Prime Minister and External Affairs Minister onwards, have done a tremendous job in putting India out on the map and putting India's concerns out on the map and delivering all of this within the framework of strategic autonomy. That India has not given up on its strategic autonomy, India has not given up on its own priorities. India continues to define its own priorities in its own way, and at the same time is willing to engage with the world on terms that are new, that are evolving, and that hopefully will give India dividend as the world order evolves in a direction that I think still remains largely unknown.
If we are looking at the recent visit by the Prime Minister to G7 in Japan, if you look at the outcomes of that, India's not part of the G7, but it's part of the extended group, which has been, and in that group, India has been receiving repeated invitations every year. Again, this is part of the fact that without India, conversation at the G7 is not complete. Isn't that the message that comes out?
G7, of course, has been in India has been a special invitee now for almost all the G7s in the last few years. In some ways, that underscores the role that India is playing in global consciousness. Without India, we will not be able to manage a lot of the turmoil. Without India, we will not be able to manage global governance. So India's presence at this high table is important. This is where India's approach of building multiple partnerships has really played off, because you can today look at any part of the world and you would see Indian presence in some way or another. And I think organizations, platforms, whether they are multilateral, whether they are unilateral, whether they are emerging or evolving, or whether they are the established ones, India continues to be a very, very important player in most of them, by virtue of the fact that some of the most interesting ideas are coming from India, as well as given India's growing health, it's not possible to conceive of solutions without Indian participation. So I think when you bring it all together, you see that confident, positive India and optimistic India is perhaps becoming, in its presence, becoming a regular feature of global politics, something that, again, a few years back would not have been conceived of. So I think a number of the factors that we have discussed, whether it's economy, leadership, diplomacy, all of them have effectively put India at the center stage of global politics. And that every single platform worth its name to find a partner in India, that would be impossible to ignore. And that's a message I think India has been sending, including to the United Nations, where Indian Prime Minister said, United Nations will have to reform, a Security Council reforms will have to happen. Otherwise, it is not India's credibility, but the UN's credibility that will be questioned, because how can you have India not present there? So I think in this way, India has turned the table on the governance structures that are prevalent.
So a more confident India than before, more in terms of confidence and in terms of profile, a much more confident, I have mentioned before, but a much more in India ready, willing to take on challenges as well as accept responsibility. So that is the new India in a way that we are seeing, and the profile of India is definitely rising. Thank you so much for this discussion, Dr. Harsh Pant. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
You were listening to a discussion on rising stature of India in the evolving global scenario. The participants were Dr. Harsh V. Pant, strategic analyst, and Elizabeth Roch, journalist. This program was produced and presented by the News Services Division of Akashvani. You can listen to it on a mobile app, News on AIR. This program is also available on our YouTube channel, News on AIR Official. You may share your feedback about this program through email at airnsdtalks@gmail.com or WhatsApp on 9289094044.